5 doctors, each paid $50,000 for their expert opinion, told the Mafia boss his daughter was brain dead and wouldn't wake again. Then a waitress who earned $7 an hour burst into the room where he was about to sign the order to end life support, threw a crumpled medical journal on the table, and said she had 90 seconds to perform one test that would prove his daughter could hear everything, or he could have her shot for wasting his time while his child died. 20 minutes earlier, she had been wiping down the counter at the Cactus Diner on East Van Buren Street, trying to ignore the throbbing pain behind her eyes that came from working 16 hours straight. The overnight shift dragged like every overnight shift did. Nothing but truckers and insomniacs and people with nowhere else to go. She refilled coffee for the 3rd time for a man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone, his knee bouncing with nervous energy that filled the entire booth. He was talking to someone on the phone, not bothering to lower his voice because people like him never worried about who might be listening. The words came through in fragments as she moved between tables. His boss's daughter, car accident 3 days ago. 5 neurologists from California, Texas, New York, all of them saying the same thing. Brain dead, no electrical activity. Time to let her go. Her hand froze halfway to refilling his water glass. The man kept talking, his voice cracking around the edges. The boss refused to accept it, kept demanding more opinions, more tests, more hope that didn't exist. The machines were the only thing keeping the girl's body alive. 17 years old. The only family the boss had left. The daughter he'd protected from everything except the one thing that finally reached her. She set the water pitcher down too hard. Coffee sloshed over the rim of the man's cup. He glared at her, annoyed at the interruption, but she had already stopped listening to his complaints. Her mind raced through everything she'd studied, every case report she'd memorized, every journal article she'd found in library databases and medical forums where real doctors discussed real patients. Brain dead, no electrical activity. Those were the words that kept catching in her thoughts like hooks. But what if they were testing wrong? She knew the hospital, Desert Valley Medical Center, the private wing where people with enough money could buy silence along with treatment. She'd driven past it 1,000 times on her way between jobs, always wondering what it looked like inside those walls where lives were saved with the kind of resources she'd never have access to. The man was still talking, complaining now about traffic and inconvenience and having to deliver bad news to someone he clearly feared. She didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed her backpack from behind the counter, ignored the cook shouting after her about her shift, and ran for the door. The decision made no sense. She knew that even as her worn sneakers hit the pavement outside, she had no credentials, no authority, no reason anyone would listen to her. The chance she was right hovered somewhere near impossible. The chance she'd get herself killed for interfering approached certainty. But 16 years ago she'd made a promise over a grave she still visited every Sunday, and that promise had carried her through every brutal year since. If there was even the smallest possibility that a girl was conscious inside a body everyone had declared dead, she couldn't walk away. She wouldn't become another person who arrived too late. The hospital sat 20 minutes across the city by car. She didn't own a car. The bus would take an hour. She ran the first 6 blocks before her lungs screamed for mercy, then forced herself into a stumbling jog that ate through the pre-dawn darkness. By the time she reached the hospital gates, sweat soaked through her uniform and the sun was starting to burn through the Phoenix haze. Security at the private wing entrance took one look at her and moved to block the doors. She didn't slow down. She crashed into the lobby shouting about locked-in syndrome and false brain death diagnosis and a test that would take 90 seconds. The guards grabbed her arms. She thrashed against them, screaming louder, demanding they listen, demanding they get the girl's father, demanding they give her one chance before they killed someone who might still be saved. Her voice cracked. Her vision blurred. She felt hands pulling her backwards toward the exit. That's when a door opened at the end of the hallway. The man who stepped through looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 3 days. Expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Eyes hollow from crying or from not sleeping or from both. But when he moved, everyone in that lobby went silent. Security released her arms and stepped back. Nurses froze mid-step. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. She'd never seen him before in her life, but she knew exactly who he was. The most dangerous man in Arizona. The criminal who controlled half the city. The father about to lose his only child. He stared at her with the blank expression of someone who'd stopped hoping for miracles but couldn't quite bring himself to stop listening for them. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by grief. What did she say about his daughter? She forced herself to stand straighter despite her shaking legs. Locked-in syndrome. A condition where patients appear completely unresponsive but remain fully conscious. The brainstem still functions. They can hear, can feel, can understand everything happening around them. But standard neurological tests miss it because those tests rely on motor responses the patient can no longer produce. 5 doctors could examine her and all reach the wrong conclusion if they were looking for the wrong signs. The man studied her face like he was trying to decide whether she was insane or inspired or some desperate combination of both. He asked what she was. A doctor? A specialist? Someone with the credentials to make claims that contradicted 5 of the country's leading neurologists? No, she was a waitress with a backpack full of library books and a theory based on years of self-study that might be completely wrong. But she'd read about this exact presentation, had memorized the case studies, had taught herself the diagnostic criteria, and if she was right, they had minutes before he signed papers that would end the life of a girl who could still be reached. Behind him, men in suits put their hands inside their jackets. The threat was unmistakable. One word from him and she'd disappear. Her body would be found in the desert, or it wouldn't be found at all. The boss looked at her for a long time, then he turned and walked back toward the room where his daughter lay surrounded by machines. He didn't tell her to follow, he didn't tell the guards to shoot her, he simply left the choice in the silence. She ran after him. The private suite looked more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital space. Cream-colored walls, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. And in the center of all that careful beauty, a hospital bed surrounded by monitoring equipment. The girl lying motionless against white sheets looked small despite being nearly grown, breathing tube down her throat, IV lines in both arms, the machines doing everything her body should have been doing on its own. 5 men in white coats stood around the bed like mourners at a wake. They turned when the boss entered, then stared in open confusion at the disheveled waitress trailing behind him. One started to object. The boss silenced him with a look that could have frozen blood. She had 90 seconds to prove herself or die trying. Her hands shook as she approached the bed. She'd studied this procedure 100 times but never performed it on an actual patient, never had someone's life depending on her being right. She positioned herself where the girl could see her, if the girl could see anything at all. She explained each step aloud, as much to steady her own nerves as to help them understand. First test: vertical eye movement in response to verbal command. Patients with locked-in syndrome often retain the ability to move their eyes up and down even when every other muscle has failed them. She leaned close to the girl's face, spoke directly to her, asked her to look up if she could hear this, to move her eyes toward the ceiling. One movement for yes, stay still for no. Nothing happened. The doctors shifted. The boss's jaw tightened. She tried again, slower this time, clearer, putting every ounce of desperate hope into her voice. Please, if you can hear me, if you're still in there, look up, just once. Show them you're fighting. The girl's eyes moved. Not much, barely a flicker, but unmistakable. Deliberate, the pupils tracked upward toward the ceiling, held for a heartbeat, then returned to center. A conscious response. Voluntary movement, proof of awareness that shattered every diagnosis in the room. One of the doctors gasped. Another rushed forward to verify what he'd just seen. The boss grabbed the edge of the bed so hard his knuckles went white. She asked the girl to look down, for no. The eyes dropped. Up for yes. The eyes lifted. The daughter of the most powerful criminal in Arizona was conscious, aware, trapped in a body that had betrayed her but alive in every way that mattered. The boss turned to look at the waitress who'd saved his daughter's life. His expression held something she couldn't name. Gratitude mixed with shock, mixed with a question he hadn't asked yet. Who was she? How did she know? Why did a stranger risk everything for a girl she'd never met? She didn't have answers, he'd believe. She only had a promise made to a grave and knowledge stolen from books she couldn't afford. The doctors were already shouting orders, recalibrating treatment plans, calling specialists in locked-in syndrome. The girl's eyes moved again, seeking the waitress's face, and she squeezed the small hand that couldn't squeeze back. If this gave you chills, tap that like button, and also don't forget to comment the country you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about hope. 16 years before she stood in that hospital room proving 5 doctors wrong, she was an 11-year-old girl named after the desert wildflowers that bloomed once a year if the rain came at the right time. She sat in the dirt on the playground of Lincoln Elementary School, watching her younger sister cartwheel across the blacktop with the fearless grace of a 9-year-old who believed the world would always catch her when she fell. The sister's name had been River, chosen by their mother who loved the sound of water in a city that thirsted through every summer. River had laughed when she landed that final cartwheel, threw her arms up in victory, then crumpled to the ground like someone had cut her strings. No warning. No chance to prepare. One moment dancing, the next moment motionless on some heated concrete that burned against bare knees when the older sister ran to her. She'd screamed for help, screamed until her throat bled. Screamed while River's eyes rolled back and her small body convulsed and blood trickled from her nose onto the asphalt. Teachers came running. The principal called 911. Other students stood frozen in a circle around them, silent witnesses to something that would haunt their nightmares for years. The ambulance took 14 minutes to arrive. 14 minutes while she held her sister's head in her lap and begged her to wake up, to breathe right, to stop scaring everyone. 14 minutes feeling River grow heavier and stiller and colder despite the phoenix heat that baked them both. 14 minutes understanding with growing horror that something fundamental had broken inside the person she loved most, and all her screaming couldn't fix it. The paramedics worked fast once they arrived, loaded River into the ambulance. Let the older sister climb in too because no one had the heart to separate them. She watched the medics perform procedures she didn't understand, saw them exchange looks that needed no translation. At the hospital, doctors used words like cerebral hemorrhage and ruptured aneurysm and catastrophic brain trauma. They said River never regained consciousness. They said she died at 4:17 in the afternoon, surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed but couldn't save her. The funeral happened 3 days later under a sky so blue it felt like an insult. Their mother cried until she vomited. Their father stood silent, turned to stone by grief. The 11-year-old girl knelt beside the grave after everyone else had left, and made a promise to the sister who couldn't hear it anymore. She would learn everything those doctors knew, would understand the human body so completely that she'd never feel this helpless again, would save other people's sisters even if she couldn't save her own. That promise became the only thing that survived the years that followed. Their parents fell apart slowly, then all at once. The mother started drinking to drown the images of River's last moments. The father worked longer hours to avoid coming home to the house that echoed with absence. When the older sister turned 14, she came home to find both parents gone, no note. No explanation, just empty rooms and unpaid bills, and the understanding that she'd been orphaned by grief even though both her parents still breathed somewhere. She lived in a storage unit behind Rodriguez Auto Repair for 2 years before anyone noticed. 10 feet by 10 feet of concrete and metal, stifling hot in summer and bone cold in winter, but it had a door that locked, and the owner looked the other way as long as she swept the shop floor every morning. She worked at the diner on East Van Buren because they didn't ask for identification she didn't have. Worked at the sandwich shop on McDowell because they paid cash. Worked anywhere that would take a teenager who lied about her age and showed up on time despite exhaustion that lived in her bones. Every spare dollar went to used medical textbooks from thrift stores and library sales. She bought anatomy guides with torn covers and outdated pharmacology manuals and nursing handbooks with notes scribbled in the margins by students who'd actually gone to college. She stole Wi-Fi from coffee shops to watch free medical lectures online, her cracked smartphone screen making everything slightly blurred but still understandable. She filled notebooks with diagrams of the circulatory system, the nervous system, the respiratory system, each drawing more detailed than the last. The librarian at the main branch on Central Avenue was 73 years old with arthritic hands and eyes that saw more than most people wanted noticed. She'd watched the girl spend every free hour in the medical section, hovering over journals and textbooks like someone starving. One winter evening when closing time came and went, she simply handed over a spare key and told her to lock up when she left. That key became salvation, a warm place to study when the storage unit grew too cold to think, access to medical databases the library subscribed to, hours upon hours of reading while the city slept outside. She taught herself to read EKG strips and interpret CT scans, and recognize symptoms of diseases she'd never seen in person. She memorized drug interactions and surgical procedures and emergency protocols. She learned about locked-in syndrome from a case study of a woman who'd spent 3 years conscious but completely paralyzed before anyone realized she could still hear, could still feel, could still suffer alone inside her motionless body. The thought of that silent horror kept her awake for weeks. The night she almost gave up came during her 20th year. She'd been fired from the sandwich shop for falling asleep during her shift. The storage unit owner had raised the rent beyond what she could manage. Her phone screen had cracked so badly she could barely read the medical videos she watched to fall asleep. She sat on the curb outside the diner at 3 a.m, crying too hard to notice the cold, and seriously considered walking into traffic just to make the exhaustion stop. Then she pulled out her wallet to count what little money remained and found the photo. River at age 7, gap-toothed smile, eyes bright with all the futures she'd never get to live. The promise came flooding back, the reason for all this suffering. the girl she'd sworn to honor by saving others. She wiped her face, stood up, and went back inside to finish her shift. 7 years later, she still lived in that storage unit, still worked 3 jobs, still spent every free moment studying medicine she'd never practiced officially, because medical school required money and credentials and a past that didn't involve living in 10 feet of rented concrete. But she kept learning anyway, kept hoping the knowledge would matter someday, kept the promise alive because it was all she had left of the sister who died in her arms on a playground 16 years ago. 16 years before he stood in a hospital room watching a stranger save his daughter, the man who would become Arizona's most feared criminal was 32 years old and holding his newborn baby for the first time while his wife bled out on the delivery table 3 feet away. The doctors worked with desperate efficiency, shouting orders and transfusing blood that poured out as fast as they pumped it in. He couldn't look away from his wife's face, couldn't process the reality forming around him like ice. They'd been married for 4 years. She'd spent the entire pregnancy glowing with joy about the daughter they'd name after her grandmother. She'd made him promise he'd protect their child from the violence that defined his world, that he'd give her a life better than the one he'd built through blood and fear. He'd promised. And now she was dying to give him the chance. The baby screamed in his arms, furious at being born into chaos. Her lungs worked perfectly. Her heart beat strong. Every part of her functioned exactly as it should, while her mother's body failed despite every intervention the medical team attempted. At 11:43 in the morning, a doctor placed a hand on his shoulder and said the words that would haunt him forever. They'd done everything possible. She was gone. He looked down at his daughter, this tiny creature who'd cost him everything, and made a vow more binding than any oath he'd sworn to the organization. He would protect her, would shield her from every threat, would burn the world to ash before he let harm reach her. She was all he had left of the woman he'd loved, and he would die before he failed to keep her safe. The years that followed transformed him from ambitious lieutenant to absolute authority. He eliminated rivals with surgical precision, built an empire that controlled construction, casinos, import businesses both legal and otherwise, made himself so dangerous that even speaking his name in certain circles required courage most men didn't possess. But every brutal decision, every calculated murder, every expansion of power served a single purpose: creating walls high enough and thick enough that nothing could touch his daughter. She grew up beautiful and brilliant and completely unaware of what her father did to keep her protected. He hired the best tutors, enrolled her in private schools, made sure she had everything except the truth about how he paid for it all. She was his redemption, his proof that something good could exist in a life built on violence. Watching her laugh made him believe he might not be completely lost. Then his second-in-command came to him on a Sunday morning in March with evidence of betrayal that demanded immediate response. The man's name was Castillo, 46 years old, with silver hair and eyes like a snake evaluating prey. He'd been with the organization since before the boss took power, had proven his loyalty 100 times over, had never given reason for doubt. He laid financial documents across the desk showing systematic theft. An accountant working for one of their front companies had been skimming money for months. Small amounts at first, then growing bolder. $500,000 gone, funneled through accounts that led to offshore banks. The accountant's name meant nothing to him. Just another employee who'd made the fatal mistake of stealing from people who didn't forgive. But Castillo added a detail that changed everything. The accountant had family, a wife, 2 daughters. The oldest was 11, the youngest 9. If they eliminated only the accountant, the family would ask questions, would potentially go to authorities, would create exposure the organization couldn't afford. The boss stared at the documents, thinking about his own daughter asleep upstairs, thinking about what it meant to have children, to love something more than your own survival. The accountant had betrayed the organization, yes, but his daughters bore no responsibility for their father's choices. They were innocent. Castillo leaned forward, voice quiet but insistent. Loose ends created problems. Witnesses created risks. The family had to go, clean sweep. No survivors to complicate the future. It was the smart play, the necessary play, the only play that guaranteed security. He should have asked more questions, should have verified the evidence himself, should have remembered that Castillo had been angling for a promotion, that eliminating a rival required manufacturing justification. But his daughter's safety overrode every other consideration, and if there was even a chance this accountant posed a threat to her protected world, he couldn't take the risk. He gave the order. The team moved that same Sunday early afternoon while Phoenix baked under relentless sun. They entered the small house in a modest neighborhood where people worked regular jobs and worried about mortgage payments. The mother died first, quick and clean before she could scream and alert the daughters. The accountant took longer because they wanted him to understand what happened to thieves. The older daughter had been in her bedroom when the shooting started. She escaped through a window, ran bleeding into the street, disappeared into the chaos of sirens and screaming neighbors. The team searched for hours but never found her. The younger daughter had hidden under the dining table, frozen with terror, watching everything. They'd been ordered to leave no witnesses. One of them raised his weapon. Castillo called it off at the last second, said the girl was too traumatized to be a credible witness, said killing children drew the kind of attention they needed to avoid. The team left her there among the bodies of her parents, small and broken and silent. 3 days later, that 9-year-old girl collapsed on a school playground. Doctors called it a stress-induced aneurysm, a 1 in a million medical event triggered by psychological trauma so severe her small body couldn't withstand it. She died without regaining consciousness. The boss never learned that detail. Never knew the accountant's younger daughter had survived the initial hit, only to die from the horror of what she'd witnessed. Never knew Castillo had been embezzling the money himself, had framed an innocent man to cover his own theft, had manufactured evidence convincing enough to fool someone who should have known better. Years later, fragments of truth surfaced. An investigation into Castillo's activities revealed discrepancies in the original documents. The boss realized what he'd done, realized he'd murdered a family for a lie, realized those 2 daughters had died because he'd been too paranoid about protecting his own child to verify the threat was real. The guilt lived in him like cancer, growing quietly, eating away at whatever humanity remained, but he buried it, blocked it down. Told himself that dwelling on the past served no purpose, that the dead stayed dead regardless of how much he regretted creating them. He had his daughter to think about, her safety, her future. Her life mattered more than his conscience. Then she turned 17, and a rival gang decided the best way to hurt him was through the only thing he loved. Now she lay in a hospital bed, declared dead by 5 specialists, and all his power meant nothing. All the violence he'd committed in her name couldn't save her. The walls he'd built had failed. And the only person who could reach her was a waitress who'd appeared out of nowhere with knowledge that defied medical consensus and desperation in her eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. 3 days before the crash that would bring them together, 2 women lived separate lives in the same city, their paths running parallel like train tracks that had no reason to ever meet. The one who would save a life woke at 4 in the morning when her phone alarm shattered the silence of the storage unit. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the same stained uniform she'd worn yesterday because laundry cost money she needed for other things. The diner on East Van Buren opened at 5, and showing up even 2 minutes late meant losing the shift to someone hungrier, someone more desperate, someone willing to work for less. She scrubbed plates and refilled coffee and smiled at customers who never looked at her face long enough to remember it. The morning rush brought truckers and construction workers, and people heading to jobs that paid enough to afford breakfast someone else cooked. She pocketed $17 in tips by 11, ate leftover hash browns the cook would have thrown away, then caught the bus to the main library on Central Avenue. The afternoon belonged to study. She claimed her usual table in the far corner of the medical section, surrounded by towers of books about neurological disorders and emergency medicine and diagnostic procedures most doctors spent years learning in schools she'd never attend. Her notebook filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams of brain structures, notes about symptoms and treatments, and the fine line between life and death that most people never thought about until they were standing on the wrong side of it. At 4:30 she packed everything away, caught another bus to the restaurant on Indian School Road, and worked the dinner shift that ended at 11, then the overnight at the Cactus Diner, where the hours between midnight and dawn stretched like torture and every minute felt like 3. She'd been running this same routine for so long she sometimes forgot what it felt like to sleep more than 4 hours or eat a meal that didn't come from someone else's leftovers. The one who would need saving woke at noon in a bedroom larger than most people's apartments. 17 years old, senior year of high school, straight-A student who could have her pick of universities if her father would let her apply anywhere that required leaving Arizona. She was brilliant and restless and slowly suffocating under the weight of protection that followed her everywhere. 3 bodyguards waited outside her private school. 2 more trailed her to piano lessons. The driver who took her to volunteer work at the animal shelter carried a gun under his jacket and never let her out of sight. Her father meant well. She understood that much, but understanding didn't make the cage feel any less confining. She'd learned to slip away in small moments. A trip to the bathroom at a restaurant where she climbed out the window. A study group at a classmate's house where she'd sneak out the back door. She craved normal teenage experiences like other people craved air, wanted to go to movies without armed escorts, wanted to meet friends at coffee shops without surveillance, wanted to feel like a person rather than a possession being guarded. That Tuesday afternoon, she convinced her driver she needed to research a school project at the main library. He waited in the parking lot while she disappeared into the stacks, then slipped out a side exit her bodyguards didn't know existed. Freedom tasted like rebellion and possibility and the faint edge of danger that made her feel alive. Inside the library, she browsed the literature section, looking for nothing in particular, enjoying the simple act of moving through space without someone watching her every step. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a young woman carrying an armful of medical textbooks. The woman jerked back, startled, and one book tumbled to the floor. They both reached for it at the same time. Their hands touched briefly as they grabbed opposite edges. The woman with the textbooks looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, uniform wrinkled from too many hours of wear, but her eyes held something fierce, something that refused to break, despite obvious fatigue. The daughter smiled, said sorry, handed over the book. The woman nodded, muttered thanks, hurried away like she had somewhere important to be. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 seconds. Neither one thought about it again. 2 hours later, the daughter's phone buzzed with messages from her increasingly frantic driver. She sighed, knowing she'd pushed her luck as far as it would stretch, and headed back toward the parking lot where lectures about responsibility and safety awaited. She texted her best friend about meeting up later that week, somewhere her father's people wouldn't find them, somewhere she could pretend to be normal for a few stolen hours. She never made it home. The rival gang had been planning the hit for weeks, waiting for the rare moment when the boss's daughter strayed from the convoy of armored vehicles and trained killers. They followed her from the library, 3 cars boxing in the sedan her driver had brought. At the intersection of 7th Street and Camelback, they executed the crash with professional precision. The impact came from the passenger side, T-bone collision at 40 miles per hour, sending her car spinning across lanes. Her head struck the window. The world went dark before she felt the second impact. The third. The roll that left metal crumpled and glass everywhere, and her body broken in ways that would have killed most people instantly. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. They extracted her from wreckage that looked unsurvivable, rushed her to Desert Valley Medical Center with injuries the trauma team couldn't believe she'd lived through. By the time her father reached the hospital, 3 doctors were already explaining that her brain had suffered catastrophic damage. At the Cactus Diner, the woman who'd bumped into her at the library refilled coffee for a man in an expensive suit. He was on the phone, voice tight with stress, talking about his boss's daughter and a car crash and neurologists flying in from across the country because money could buy expertise even if it couldn't buy miracles. The waitress's hand trembled as she set down the coffee pot. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how these 2 lives collide, because when they do, nothing will ever be the same. The 5 neurologists stood in a semicircle around the hospital bed like judges delivering a death sentence. Each one had flown in from a different city, each one carried credentials that could fill a wall, and each one had reached the identical conclusion after examining the 17-year-old girl who lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets. No cortical activity, no response to painful stimuli, no reflexes beyond the automatic functions the brainstem controlled. Brain deaf in everything but the final paperwork. The lead specialist, a man from Johns Hopkins with grey hair and tired eyes, addressed the boss with the careful tone doctors used when hope had run out. They'd performed every test, reviewed every scan, consulted with colleagues across the country. The damage from the crash had been too severe. His daughter's higher brain functions had ceased. The machines breathing for her were preserving a body whose mind had already gone. Continuing treatment served no medical purpose. The kindest thing he could do now was let her go peacefully. The boss sat in a leather chair pulled close to his daughter's bedside, his hand wrapped around hers. Holding on like physical contact alone could pull her back from wherever she'd gone. He'd built an empire on the ability to solve problems through force or money or strategic elimination of obstacles. But this problem had no solution he could buy or threaten or kill his way through. He looked at the waitress standing near the door, the stranger who'd crashed into his grief with wild claims about misdiagnosis and hidden consciousness. She stepped forward before courage could abandon her. Her voice came out stronger than she felt, loud enough to cut through the doctor's professional certainty. They were wrong. Not incompetent, not careless, but wrong about what they were looking at. The tests they'd performed were designed to detect brain death in patients who'd lost all neurological function, but those same tests would miss locked-in syndrome, a condition where the higher brain remained intact while motor pathways suffered complete damage. One of the neurologists, a woman from Stanford, turned to face her with barely concealed irritation. Locked-in syndrome presented with specific markers, preserved consciousness, voluntary eye movement, cognitive function trapped in a paralyzed body. They tested for those exact signs. Found nothing. The scans showed massive trauma inconsistent with preserved awareness. The waitress met her gaze without flinching. The scans showed brainstem damage, yes, but localized injury that could sever motor pathways while leaving cortical function intact. Standard neurological exams relied on motor responses the patient could no longer produce. Touch the hand and look for withdrawal, apply painful pressure and check for reaction. But what if the patient felt everything, understood everything, simply couldn't move to show it? She moved closer to the bed, pulling a crumpled journal article from her backpack. The paper detailed a case from France. A woman declared brain dead after a stroke. Family fought to keep her on life support despite medical consensus. 6 weeks later, new imaging revealed preserved activity in regions controlling consciousness. The woman had been aware the entire time, listening to doctors discuss ending her life, unable to signal that she was still present. The Johns Hopkins specialist took the article, skimmed it, handed it back with a shake of his head. One case study from a foreign journal did not overturn established diagnostic criteria. They'd examined hundreds of patients over decades of practice. This young woman showed none of the signs of locked-in syndrome. Her eyes remained fixed. Her pupils responded to light through reflex alone. No voluntary movement existed. The boss's voice cut through the argument like a blade. Let her try. They'd already told him his daughter was gone. One more test couldn't make things worse. If there was even the smallest chance these experts had missed something, he needed to know before he signed papers that would stop her heart forever. The doctors exchanged looks heavy with skepticism, but stepped back from the bed. The waitress approached slowly, every nerve screaming that she was about to humiliate herself in front of the country's leading neurologists. Her hands shook as she positioned herself where the girl could see her, if the girl could see anything at all. Everything she knew about locked-in syndrome came from books and case studies, and medical forums where she'd absorbed knowledge like someone dying of thirst. She'd never performed these tests on an actual patient, never had someone's life hanging on whether her theoretical understanding translated to practical application. She leaned close to the girl's face, close enough to see the faint flutter of eyelashes, the barely perceptible movement of air through the breathing tube. She spoke directly to her, soft but clear, explaining what she was about to do, testing for voluntary eye movement, looking for any sign of conscious control. She asked the girl to move her eyes upward if she could hear this, to look toward the ceiling. One deliberate movement to prove everyone in this room had given up too soon. Nothing happened. Seconds stretched into eternity while machines beeped their steady rhythm and the doctors watched with expressions ranging from pity to annoyance. The waitress tried again, slower this time, putting every ounce of desperate belief into her voice. Please, if you're still in there, if you can hear me, look up just once. Show them you're fighting to come back. The girl's eyes moved, not dramatically, not obviously, but unmistakably upward, pupils tracking toward the ceiling in a motion too deliberate to be random. They held position for 2 full seconds before returning to center. Voluntary movement, conscious response. Proof that contradicted 3 days of expert evaluation. The Stanford neurologist gasped and rushed forward to verify what she'd witnessed. The others crowded closer, demanding to see it again, their skepticism fracturing under the weight of observable evidence. The waitress asked the girl to look down for no. The eyes dropped. Up for yes. The eyes lifted. Down, up, down. Each movement precise, purposeful, shattering every diagnosis that had declared her beyond reach. The boss made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, squeezing his daughter's hand hard enough to hurt if she could feel it. The neurologists were already recalibrating, pulling up scans on tablets, discussing treatment protocols for locked-in syndrome that none of them had considered necessary an hour ago. They called specialists in rehabilitation, in assistive communication devices, in long-term care for patients who would need years to recover functions most people took for granted. The waitress stepped back from the bed, legs suddenly unsteady, the adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour draining away all at once. She'd been right, against impossible odds, against expert consensus, against every rational reason to doubt herself. She'd been right. The girl was conscious, trapped and terrified, but alive in every way that mattered. The room tilted, her vision blurred. She felt herself falling before her knees hit the floor, felt hands catching her before she could collapse completely. The boss was there, lowering her into a chair, his face transformed by gratitude and wonder and questions he didn't know how to ask. Who was she? How did she know? Why did a stranger risk everything to save someone she'd never met? She couldn't answer, couldn't form words through the emotion choking her throat. She'd kept her promise to River, had saved a life the way she couldn't save her sister, had proven that all those years of poverty and studying and refusing to give up had meant something after all. The boss gave the order before leaving the hospital that first night. He wanted to know everything about the waitress who'd saved his daughter's life. Her name, her history, where she lived, how she'd learned medicine that contradicted the country's leading specialists. He needed to understand who she was before he could decide what she deserved as payment for the miracle she'd performed. The report arrived on his desk 36 hours later, 23 pages documenting a life that read like systematic punishment for the crime of surviving. Her name was Poppy Hartley, age 27, no permanent address listed because she lived in a storage unit behind an auto repair shop on the south side. 3 jobs, none paying more than minimum wage, none offering benefits or security or hope of advancement. Bank account holding $214. No car, no health insurance. No family. That final detail made him pause. No family. The report explained why. Parents deceased, circumstances unclear from public records. One younger sister died at age 9 from a brain aneurysm. Poppy had been 11 when she became an orphan, spent time in state care before disappearing from the system at age 14. The investigator had found her eventually, working under the table at diners and restaurants, living in spaces not meant for human habitation, studying medical textbooks like someone preparing for an exam that would never come. He read through her employment history, the thrift store purchases of outdated anatomy guides, the library records showing she'd checked out the same neurology journals hundreds of times. The picture formed slowly. A woman who'd taught herself medicine through sheer obsessive determination, who'd spent 13 years learning to save lives despite having no credentials, no mentorship, no reason to believe the knowledge would ever matter beyond abstract understanding. The final page of the report hit him like a bullet through the chest. Previous name, Poppy Marie Hartley. Father, Thomas Hartley, accountant, deceased March 19th, 16 years ago. Mother, Christine Hartley, deceased same date. Younger sister, River Hartley, died March 22nd, 3 days after parents' deaths. Official cause listed as home invasion gone wrong. Surviving family, one daughter Poppy, 11 years old at time of incident. He read the names again. Thomas Hartley. The accountant Castillo had claimed was embezzling. The innocent man he'd ordered killed based on fabricated evidence he'd been too paranoid to verify. The father of 2 daughters who'd paid for crimes they never committed. Poppy had been 11. The older daughter who'd escaped through a bedroom window, who'd run into the street covered in her mother's blood, who'd disappeared before his people could find her. River had been 9. The younger daughter who'd hidden under the dining table, who'd watched her parents die, who'd survived the hit only to collapse 3 days later from trauma so severe her small body couldn't withstand it. This waitress standing in his daughter's hospital room was the girl he'd orphaned 16 years ago, the survivor of his greatest sin. The living consequence of his failure to question orders from someone he'd trusted. She'd grown up in poverty because he'd killed her parents. She'd lived in storage units and worked herself to exhaustion because he'd destroyed the family that would have protected her. She'd taught herself medicine because she'd watched her sister die and made a promise to honor that loss. And she'd saved his daughter's life. The impossible irony crushed him under weights he couldn't measure. She didn't know who he was, didn't recognize the man who'd signed the order that murdered her family. She looked at him and saw only a desperate father, someone worthy of help despite being a stranger. She'd risked everything to save his child, while having no idea he was responsible for killing hers. He sat in his office for 3 hours, staring at the report, trying to understand what cosmic justice or cruel fate had arranged this collision. Poppy Hartley had every reason to hate him, to want him dead, to watch his daughter die with the same indifference he'd shown when ordering her family's elimination, but she'd fought to save her anyway. The specialists he'd hired began arriving the next day. Experts in locked-in syndrome from rehabilitation centers across the country, speech therapists who worked with patients who'd lost the ability to communicate, physical therapists who specialized in retraining damaged neural pathways. He paid whatever they charged, cleared entire wings of the hospital to give his daughter the space and resources she needed. Poppy showed up every morning at 6, before her shift at the diner, to sit with his daughter and talk her through the exercises. She explained each step with patience that seemed infinite, celebrated tiny victories like a finger twitch or an attempt at facial movement. She brought library books about recovery and read them aloud in a voice that carried hope neither of them had any right to feel. He watched from the doorway sometimes, studying the way Poppy held his daughter's hand, the genuine affection in her eyes when the girl managed to blink deliberately or move her lips into something resembling a smile. This woman, who'd lost everything to his violence, showed more compassion in 5 minutes than he'd demonstrated in years of protecting his daughter through force and fear. After 2 weeks, when his daughter had progressed enough to communicate through eye blinks and small head movements, he pulled Poppy aside in the hospital corridor. He tried to find words for gratitude that felt adequate, tried to explain that she'd given him back the only thing in his life worth having. He offered her money, more money than she'd earned in 10 years at the diner, enough to finish actual medical school, to stop living in a storage unit, to build the life she deserved. She refused before he finished speaking. She didn't want his money, didn't need his gratitude. She only wanted to make sure his daughter recovered. That was payment enough. Knowing she'd kept her promise to save her life when doctors had given up, he insisted, tried to press a cashier's check into her hands. She stepped back like the paper burned. Her voice came out hard, defensive. Years of poverty making her suspicious of gifts that came with invisible strings. She'd helped because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected reward. She didn't want to owe him anything, didn't want connections that would complicate the clear simplicity of what had happened. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to confess everything, to explain that she'd saved the daughter of the man who destroyed her family, to beg for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by cowardice and shame, and the terrible knowledge that telling her would end the only good thing he'd witnessed in years. So he watched her care for his daughter and said nothing, watched her refuse every offer of help, watched her leave each day to work shifts that would break stronger people, then return the next morning with the same fierce determination. She was everything he'd failed to be, honourable despite having every reason to become cruel, generous despite having nothing, strong in ways that had nothing to do with violence or power. Real talk, if you've watched this far, you're invested. Subscribe to see how this impossible situation resolves. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. 6 weeks after Poppy saved his daughter's life, the girl could move her right hand enough to grip a pencil, could form words through careful manipulation of muscles that had forgotten how to obey commands, could smile when Poppy walked into the room each morning, a lopsided expression that looked like joy fighting through damage. The progress came in increments so small that some days felt like failure, but the specialists agreed she was beating every prediction they'd made. Poppy arrived at dawn most mornings, worked through breakfast helping with physical therapy, then rushed to her first shift at the diner. She'd return in the afternoon, spend hours reading to the girl or helping her practice communication, then disappear to her evening jobs. The boss had stopped offering money after the 5th refusal. Instead, he simply made sure she had coffee waiting when she arrived, food when she looked too tired to remember eating, a car service to drive her between the hospital and work even though she protested the waste. His guilt had grown into something alive and vicious, eating through his chest every time he watched Poppy demonstrate the finger exercises that would help his daughter write again. Every smile she offered the girl felt like condemnation. Every gentle word of encouragement screamed the accusation he deserved. He'd tried twice to tell her the truth. Once late at night when she was leaving and exhaustion had made her guard drop. Once in his office when she'd come to discuss his daughter's progress and he'd almost confessed everything. Both times the words had died before reaching his mouth. He told himself he was protecting her from unnecessary pain, that knowing wouldn't change the past, that his daughter needed Poppy's help and revealing the truth would drive her away. But deeper down, in places he didn't examine closely, he knew he was simply a coward. Afraid of losing the only person who looked at him without fear, afraid of seeing her care transform into hatred, afraid of facing the consequences he'd avoided for 16 years. Castillo learned the truth by accident. The boss's second-in-command had been reviewing security footage from the hospital when he noticed something familiar about the woman spending so much time with the boss's daughter. He'd run facial recognition, found old photos from 16 years ago, school pictures of 2 girls who'd lived in a house his team had cleared on a Sunday morning. The older daughter, the one who'd escaped, the one who'd apparently survived poverty and obscurity to emerge as the person keeping the boss's child alive. He'd studied the footage for hours, watching Poppy work with the girl, seeing the genuine affection between them, understanding immediately that if she ever learned who'd ordered her family killed, the boss would lose the one thing keeping his daughter's recovery on track. And if the boss learned that Castillo had been the one to frame her innocent father, to fabricate evidence that led to their deaths, the consequences would be fatal. So Castillo made a decision that seemed simple at the time. He'd plant evidence. Let Poppy discover the truth in a way that pointed blame squarely at the boss while keeping Castillo's name buried in history. He forged documents from 16 years ago, ones that showed the boss signing execution orders for Thomas Hartley and his family, Made them look official, complete with dates and details that would be impossible to fake unless you'd been present when it happened. Left them in the boss's study where Poppy would find them during one of her visits to discuss his daughter's care. She discovered the papers on a Thursday afternoon when the boss had stepped out to take a call. She'd been waiting in his study looking for something to read to pass the time when she saw the folder marked with her father's name. Curiosity pulled her forward. Dread pulled in her stomach before she'd read the first line. By the second page her hands were shaking. By the last page her world had shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Thomas Hartley. Christine Hartley, 2 daughters, ages 11 and 9, eliminate entire family. No witnesses. The order laid out in cold clinical detail dated the day before her mother died. And at the bottom, a signature she'd seen on hospital paperwork a dozen times. The man whose daughter she'd saved. The man who'd offered her money and kindness and gratitude. The man responsible for destroying her entire family. She ran through the villa looking for him, the documents clutched in her fist, rage and grief and betrayal burning through her veins like poison. She found him in the hallway outside his daughter's room, saw his face change when he noticed what she was holding, saw guilt and recognition and resignation cross his features before she even opened her mouth. She screamed at him that 16 years she'd lived in hell because of him. 16 years wondering who'd killed her family. 16 years carrying pain he'd caused. She lunged forward and hit him with everything she had, fists crashing into his face and chest and shoulders. He didn't block, didn't defend, didn't move except to stagger backwards from the force of blows fueled by grief that had waited 16 years to find a target. He told her everything when she finally stopped hitting him long enough to demand answers. Told her about Castillo's evidence, the embezzlement claims, his failure to verify the threat. Told her he'd learned the truth years later, that her father had been innocent, that he'd murdered a family based on lies he'd been too paranoid to question. Told her he was sorry, in a voice that cracked around the word. Knowing sorry meant nothing, changed nothing, brought no one back from the dead. She didn't want to hear excuses, didn't care that he'd been deceived. Her parents were still dead. River was still gone. Her entire childhood had been stolen. All the poverty, all the suffering, all the years she'd spent surviving alone traced back to this man's signature on an execution order. She ran from the compound with tears blurring her vision and hate filling spaces in her chest that had held something dangerously close to trust. But she'd barely reached the gates before reality crashed through her rage. The boss's daughter had started speaking 3-syllable words yesterday, had managed to lift a spoon to her mouth for the first time, had whispered Poppy's name with such joy it had made her cry. The girl's recovery was far from complete. She still needed months of therapy, maybe years, and Poppy was the only person who could reach her when frustration made her want to give up. She stood at the entrance to the compound, torn between hatred for the father and responsibility to the daughter, between the promise she'd made to River and the rage she felt towards the man who'd made that promise necessary, between running away forever and going back to finish what she'd started. The choice felt impossible. Castillo watched Poppy leave the compound through security cameras positioned at every gate, and knew his window had arrived. The boss had locked himself in his study, drowning in guilt that made him vulnerable in ways Castillo had never seen before. The organization was distracted. The guards were focused on internal drama rather than external threats. The perfect moment to seize power from a man too broken to defend it. He made his move 3 hours after sunset. 6 loyal men, hand-picked over months of careful preparation, entered the boss's daughter's hospital suite through a service entrance that security had neglected to monitor. The girl had been working on writing exercises, her hand cramping around a pencil, determination etched across features still learning to form expressions again. She didn't see them coming until Hams grabbed her wheelchair and began pushing toward the exit. Poppy had returned despite her rage, had walked back through those gates driven by the promise she'd made to River, and the reality that this 17-year-old girl bore no responsibility for her father's sins. She'd been sitting in the hospital cafeteria forcing down coffee she didn't want, trying to sort through emotions that felt too large for her body to contain. Her phone buzzed with the text from the nurse assigned to the daughter's care. Simple message. 3 words that made her blood freeze. She's been taken. Poppy ran toward the suite, arrived to find it empty, equipment still beeping but the wheelchair gone and the window open to air that smelled like exhaust and violence. Security footage showed men in dark clothes, faces obscured, moving with military precision. They'd taken the girl out through the parking garage, loaded her into a van that had no license plates, disappeared into Phoenix traffic before anyone realized what had happened. The boss received the call 20 minutes later, Castillo's voice on the other end, calm and professional, explaining the new reality. He had the daughter. Had the waitress too, grabbed from the hospital parking lot when she tried to follow the van on foot. Both women were alive and would remain that way as long as the boss cooperated with the transition of power currently taking place. Castillo wanted control of the organization, wanted the territories, the businesses, the network of contacts and corruption the boss had spent decades building. In exchange, he'd return the daughter unharmed. Refuse, and he'd send her back in pieces small enough to fit in a shoebox. The boss had 12 hours to decide whether his pride mattered more than his child's life. The compound where Castillo held them sat 40 miles outside Phoenix, abandoned industrial property surrounded by desert that stretched empty in every direction. Poppy woke in a concrete room that still smelled like chemicals from whatever manufacturing had happened there before the business failed. Her head throbbed where someone had hit her. Her wrists were bound with zip ties that cut into skin when she tried to move. The boss's daughter lay on the floor beside her, breathing but barely conscious, her recovery set back by rough handling that had undone weeks of careful progress. Poppy rolled toward her despite bound hands, checking her pupils, her pulse, the angle of her neck to make sure nothing had broken during transport. The girl's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Poppy's face with confusion that transformed into fear when memory returned. Poppy whispered that it would be okay. A lie, probably. But the girl needed hope more than truth. She managed to work her hands around to check the IV port in the girl's arm, making sure the tube hadn't been ripped out when they'd moved her. The port was intact, but the IV bag was gone. Without fluids and medication, the girl would deteriorate fast. Her body depended on careful management of a dozen different systems still learning to function independently. Castillo came in an hour later, flanked by 2 armed men who watched Poppy like she might somehow pose a threat despite being bound and weaponless. He explained the situation with the detached tone of someone describing a business transaction. The boss would agree to his terms or both women would die. Simple economics. The daughter's life in exchange for an empire, a trade any father would make. Poppy asked about medical supplies for the girl. Castillo shrugged, said she'd survive long enough for the exchange. After that, what happened to either of them stopped being his concern. He left them in that concrete room with nothing but each other and fear that grew heavier as hours passed. The girl's condition worsened as dawn approached. Fever spiked from infection or stress or the simple fact that her traumatized body couldn't handle additional shock. Poppy tore strips from her own shirt to wet with condensation from the walls, used them to cool the girl's burning skin. She talked her through breathing exercises, kept her calm when panic threatened, used every scrap of medical knowledge she possessed to keep her stable despite having no equipment and no supplies. The boss didn't wait 12 hours to respond, he waited 6. Gathering every loyal operative who hadn't turned to Castillo, assembling weapons and vehicles and a plan that depended on speed and overwhelming force. He knew the compound, had used it himself years ago for purposes he'd tried to forget, knew the layout, the access points, the places where defense would be weakest. The assault began at dawn when desert heat was just starting to build. 20 men against Castillo's 6. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes but felt like hours compressed into moments of chaos and gunfire and blood. The boss led from the front, moving through that compound like vengeance given human form, killing anyone who stood between him and the room where his daughter was held. Poppy heard the shooting through concrete walls, felt the vibrations of explosions that shook dust from the ceiling. She threw herself over the girl, using her own body as a shield, whispering promises that help was coming even though she had no way to know if that was true. Bullets tore through the door. Men shouted orders. Someone screamed. The chaos built until it felt like the world was ending. Then the door burst open, and the boss stood there, covered in blood that belonged to other people, eyes wild with an emotion Poppy couldn't name. He crossed to them in 3 strides, checking his daughter first, making sure she was breathing and whole. Then he turned to Poppy, cut the zip ties from her wrists, asked if she was hurt. Castillo appeared in the doorway behind him, weapon raised, final desperate attempt to salvage a coup that had already failed. The boss moved faster than thought, gun already in his hand. 3 shots to center mass before Castillo could pull his trigger. The second in command, who'd framed an innocent man 16 years ago, died without understanding that his sins had finally caught him. The boss lifted his daughter from the floor, cradling her like she weighed nothing, and carried her toward the helicopter waiting outside. Poppy followed on unsteady legs, her body finally registering all the fear and pain she'd suppressed to keep the girl alive. They climbed into the helicopter as the compound burned behind them, smoke rising into cloudless sky. During the flight back to Phoenix, while the girl slept between them and rotors beat steady rhythm overhead, the boss tried to apologize again. Poppy cut him off before he finished. She told him through tears that had nothing to do with forgiveness that she didn't forgive him, would never forgive him. But she wouldn't let his daughter suffer for his sins. The girl deserved better than being caught in the middle of hatred that predated her birth. The boss nodded, accepting judgment he'd earned 16 years ago. Recovery happened in increments too small to celebrate until you looked back and realized how far the journey had traveled. 3 months after the kidnapping, the boss's daughter could hold a spoon without dropping it. 6 months later, she managed 3 steps from wheelchair to bed with assistance. 9 months in, she spoke her first complete sentence since the accident. Words slurred but comprehensible, asking Poppy to please stay a little longer because the exercises hurt less when she was there. Poppy had moved into a guest room at the compound 2 weeks after the rescue. The decision came from necessity rather than forgiveness. The girl's recovery required consistency. Someone present who understood both her medical needs and the psychological trauma of being trapped in a paralyzed body. The physical therapists were excellent at their jobs, but they arrived for scheduled sessions and left when their hours ended. The girl needed someone who would be there at 3 in the afternoon when frustration made her want to quit, and again at midnight when phantom sensations convinced her she'd never feel her own body again. The boss had offered to pay for medical school before Poppy could finish unpacking her few possessions from the storage unit. She'd refused on instinct, still raw from betrayal, still determined not to accept anything from the man who destroyed her family. He'd asked again a week later, explained that putting her through school served his daughter's interests, not his own guilt. The girl trusted Poppy in ways she'd never trust another doctor. If Poppy became a real physician, his daughter would have the best possible care for years to come. Poppy had accepted on the 3rd offer, not as forgiveness. She'd made that clear. Not because his money could erase the past, but because her family had been killed to protect his interests, and if he owed anyone restitution, it was the daughter of the man he'd murdered. Thomas Hartley's child deserved the education poverty had stolen. She'd take his money, finish medical school, become the doctor her father would have been proud of. Consider it partial payment on a debt that could never be fully settled. She started pre-med courses at Arizona State that fall, attending classes in the morning before returning to help with afternoon therapy sessions. The material she'd taught herself through library books and stolen Wi-Fi suddenly had structure, official validation, professors who could answer questions she'd been guessing at for years. She absorbed everything like someone making up for lost time. Every lecture a step closer to honoring the promise made to River 16 years ago. The boss transformed his organization with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once used to build it. Sold off illegal operations to rivals who didn't ask questions, converted front companies into legitimate businesses actually designed to turn profit through legal means, walked away from contracts that required violence or corruption or compromises he could no longer justify. The process took months and cost him relationships with people who'd been loyal since before his daughter was born. He told Poppy once, late on a Saturday afternoon when she'd stayed to work on his daughter's speech therapy, that he was trying to become someone worthy of the miracle she'd performed. Someone his daughter could look at without eventually learning to feel ashamed. He didn't expect redemption, didn't think becoming legitimate erased crimes committed when he'd operated in shadows. But maybe he could at least stop adding to the weight of guilt that woke him every morning. Poppy had listened without responding. Some days she still hated him with an intensity that made her hand shake when they were in the same room. Days when she'd catch sight of his face and see only the signature on execution orders. Hear only River's voice asking why their parents weren't coming home. Other days she saw a broken man carrying grief that mirrored her own. Someone who'd lost the person he loved most and had spent years trying to protect the only piece of her that remained. Healing refused to follow a straight line from hatred to acceptance. It doubled back, circled around, repeated the same painful territory until the path wore smooth from travel. The bond between Poppy and the girl grew deeper than biology or obligation. They spent hours together, working through exercises that built strength back into damaged muscles, developing communication systems for thoughts too complex to express through limited speech. The girl's sense of humor emerged slowly, dry observations about the absurdity of relearning how to walk delivered through words that required immense effort to form. She laughed when Poppy made mistakes, cried when progress felt impossible, held on during moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. One morning in early spring, while working through facial exercises designed to improve articulation, the girl looked at Poppy and said her name clearly for the first time, then added 3 more words that came out tangled but unmistakable. "You saved me." Poppy had broken down completely. 16 years of carrying a promise she'd thought might destroy her. 16 years of studying medicine she believed she'd never practice. 16 years of wondering if River would consider the life she'd built sufficient payment for survival. And now this girl, the daughter of her enemy, was telling her the one thing she'd needed to hear since she was 11 years old, watching her sister die in her arms. She'd kept her promise, had saved her life, had learned enough medicine to prove 5 doctors wrong and pull someone back from the edge where everyone else had given up. River would have been proud. Their parents would have understood. The years of suffering had produced something meaningful after all. The girl asked Poppy to stay permanently on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months before she was scheduled to graduate from medical school. They'd been working on walking unassisted, the girl managing 10 steps before exhaustion forced her back to the wheelchair. She'd looked up at Poppy with eyes that held both hope and fear of rejection, asked if she'd consider staying after graduation, not as hired help, but as family, the only person who'd fought for her when everyone else had been ready to let her go. Poppy agreed before fully thinking through the implications. She was staying for the girl, she clarified, not for the boss. Not because she'd forgiven him or accepted him or found peace with the past, but because this 17-year-old had become someone she loved despite every reason not to, and walking away now would break a different kind of promise. 3 years after proving 5 specialists wrong, Dr. Poppy Hartley stood in a lecture hall at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, teaching second-year students about neurological conditions most doctors would never encounter in their entire careers. She'd graduated top of her class despite starting medical school 7 years older than her classmates, despite working part-time throughout to maintain some independence from money that still felt tainted by its source. Her specialty had chosen itself: locked-in syndrome and severe brain injuries. Patients other physicians declared hopeless. Cases where families were told to let go, to accept loss, to stop fighting battles medical consensus had already decided were lost. She'd built a practice around being the doctor who looked closer, who questioned assumptions, who remembered that behind every diagnosis was a person still fighting to be heard. The clinic opened 6 months after she finished her residency. Small facility on the east side of Phoenix, 10 beds, equipment purchased through a donation from an anonymous benefactor everyone knew was the boss trying to atone for sins that couldn't be erased through money alone. She'd accepted his funding the same way she'd accepted tuition payments, not as forgiveness, but as restitution owed to the family he'd destroyed. Let him pour his guilt into something that saved lives instead of ending them. Her first patient had been a 40-year-old woman declared brain dead after a stroke. 3 neurologists had recommended withdrawing life support. Poppy had spent 2 hours at her bedside testing responses the standard protocols missed, and found consciousness buried beneath damage everyone else had mistaken for death. The woman was communicating through eye movements now, working with speech therapists, making progress doctors had sworn was impossible. The boss's daughter had recovered beyond anyone's predictions, 20 years old now, attending Arizona State University, studying psychology because she wanted to help people trapped in their own minds the way she'd been trapped in her paralyzed body. She volunteered at Poppy's clinic 3 afternoons a week, talking to patients who were just beginning the brutal journey she'd already completed, offering hope from someone who understood exactly what they were enduring. She walked with a slight limp that physical therapy would probably never eliminate. Her speech carried a faint slur that emerged when she was tired or stressed, but she was alive, whole, pursuing dreams that had seemed impossible when 5 doctors had declared her beyond saving. She called Poppy by her first name in casual conversation, but sometimes late at night would whisper thank you like a prayer to someone who'd refused to give up. The relationship between Poppy and the boss had evolved into something neither could easily define. Not friendship, certainly not romance, but a cautious respect built on shared love for the young woman they'd both protected in different ways. He stayed in the background of the clinic's operations, never interfering, never asking for recognition, simply ensuring Poppy had the resources to help patients no one else would treat. They didn't discuss the past often. Some wounds were too deep to heal through conversation, but they'd reached an understanding that forgiveness wasn't required for 2 people to exist in the same space, working toward the same goal, bound by tragedy that had transformed them both. On a Sunday morning in April, Poppy visited the cemetery where her family rested beneath an oak tree that had grown taller in the years since she'd last knelt at these graves. She placed wildflowers on each headstone, the same desert bloom she'd been named after, and told them everything that had happened since she'd made her promise 16 years ago. She told River about medical school, about the clinic, about becoming the doctor she'd sworn to be when she was 11 years old and powerless to save the person she loved most. She explained that she'd kept her promise in ways she never could have imagined, had saved the daughter of the man who'd ordered their parents killed, had found her purpose through the same tragedy that had destroyed her childhood. The boss arrived while she was still speaking, maintaining respectful distance at the edge of the cemetery. He'd asked once if he could come to pay respects to the family his actions had orphaned. She'd agreed, understanding that he needed this closure as much as she did. He stood silent, head bowed, a man carrying guilt that would follow him to his own grave. His daughter appeared minutes later, walking across grass still wet with morning dew, and stood between them both. Three people bound by violence and survival and the strange redemption that came from choosing to save rather than destroy. The girl took Poppy's hand, then reached for her father's, creating a connection none of them had asked for but all of them needed. Poppy returned to teaching that afternoon. Standing before students who would become the next generation of physicians, she told them about locked-in syndrome, about the importance of looking beyond standard protocols, about patients who'd been declared hopeless until someone refused to accept that verdict. 5 doctors said impossible, she told them. I proved them wrong, not because I had degrees or credentials they lacked, but because I had something they didn't, a promise I refused to break. Sometimes the impossible just means nobody's tried the right way yet. And sometimes the people we save end up saving us back. In the back of the lecture hall, the boss's daughter sat taking notes, smiling at the woman who'd given her a second chance at life. The circle had closed, the promise had been kept, and from tragedy had grown something neither revenge nor forgiveness, but simply the choice to turn pain into purpose and help others find their way back from the darkness. That's how a waitress proved 5 doctors wrong and saved a life no one believed could be saved. If my story moved you, I would really appreciate it if you could share your thoughts about my videos in the comments. Your feedback helps me improve and create even better content for you. Thank you for being here.